A homeless mother and her kids beg for shelter in a luxury hotel, but the door slams shut in their faces. The rich sip champagne. The staff look away. No one cares, until Shaquille O'Neal walks in. What starts as a confrontation turns into a battle for justice, exposing deep corruption and shocking secrets. When the truth comes out, one empire will crumble, and a new legacy will rise. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Atlanta was a city of contrasts. Towering glass skyscrapers cast long shadows over run-down neighborhoods, where people struggled to make it through the day. Luxury cars purred through streets lined with corner stores and bus stops crowded with tired faces. It was a place where wealth and struggle existed side by side, but only a few ever got to cross the invisible line that separated the two. And Shaquille O'Neal knew that line better than anyone. Shaq had seen both sides of the world, the hunger of poverty and the excess of wealth. He had grown up knowing what it meant to wonder if there would be food on the table. He had seen his mother, Lucille O'Neal, stretch every last dollar, sacrificing her own comfort to make sure Shaq and his siblings had a shot at a better future. And when that future came, when he became a legend, a businessman, a millionaire many times over, he never forgot the struggle. Even now, with an empire under his name, Shaq wasn't the type to turn a blind eye to the world that shaped him. So when he scrolled through his phone late one night, sipping on a protein shake in his Atlanta penthouse, he wasn't looking at investment reports or real estate deals. He was looking at something real, something that hit home, a viral video. And in it, a woman, 2 kids, a hotel lobby, and a door being slammed in their faces. Rachel Coleman didn't ask for much. She had been working 2 jobs, trying to keep her family afloat after her husband died in a car accident. But Atlanta was unforgiving. Rent kept rising, bills stacked up, and one bad month turned into 2, then 3. And suddenly, the Colemans weren't in their apartment anymore. For the past week, she and her kids, Elijah, 10, and Ava, 7, had been sleeping in their car. The nights were getting colder, the back seat wasn't meant for sleeping, and Elijah had started coughing 3 days ago. She had tried every shelter in the city, all full. Her last hope? The Sterling Grand Hotel. The Sterling Grand was the kind of place where people dropped thousands on a single night's stay. The kind of place where a mother like Rachel didn't belong. Or at least, that's what the staff believed. But she had money. Not much, but enough for a night. Enough to get her kids into a warm bed, even if just for a few hours. So she walked into the lobby, her children clutching her sides, their jackets too thin for the weather outside. She approached the front desk. The manager, Preston Whitmore, barely glanced up. Rachel cleared her throat. "I need a room. Just for the night." Preston's gaze traveled from her worn-out coat to the way Ava was hugging her brother's side, shivering. His lips curled into a polite, dismissive smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have availability." Rachel's stomach twisted. "Please, I can pay." She reached into her purse, pulling out every last dollar she had. Preston let out a short, condescending laugh. "I don't think this is the place you're looking for." Rachel's fingers tightened around the money. "But you do have rooms, right?" His smile faded. "I said we don't have availability." He wasn't even trying to hide it. He wasn't saying no because they were full. He was saying no because of who she was. She felt her cheeks burn with shame. Elijah, standing beside her, stared at Preston. Not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. Rachel swallowed hard, grabbed her kids' hands, and turned toward the door. As she walked away, she heard the hushed whispers of guests in the lobby, the sound of laughter from a group sipping cocktails at the bar. Not one person had spoken up. Not everyone in the hotel agreed with Preston. Noah Carter, a hotel employee, had been standing near the entrance, watching the whole thing unfold. And something about it didn't sit right with him. He had seen too many people like Preston pretend they were gatekeepers to a world built for the rich. He had seen too many families like Rachel's be treated as if they were invisible. So he did something reckless, something that could cost him his job. He took out his phone and started recording. By the time Rachel and her kids were back in their car, parked in a dark lot down the street, The internet had already exploded. Noah had uploaded the video with a simple caption, "This is what the Sterling Grand stands for." And within hours, it spread like wildfire. People were furious. Some called for a boycott of the hotel. Others demanded an apology. And then, somewhere in the late hours of the night, Shaquille O'Neal saw it. He played the video twice, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. A short, simple call. "Clear my morning. I got business to handle." The next morning, a Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up in front of the Sterling Grand Hotel. Guests stared. Employees froze. And when the door opened, and Shaq stepped out, all 7 feet 1 inch of him, dressed in a sleek designer suit but with an expression that said he wasn't here for games, the entire energy in the hotel shifted. Preston Whitmore, watching from behind the front desk, felt his throat go dry. Because if there was one thing men like him feared most, it was a man with power they couldn't control. And Shaquille O'Neal was about to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of power he had. The Sterling Grand Hotel prided itself on luxury, exclusivity, and prestige. Its marble floors gleamed under the chandelier lights, its walls adorned with gold-framed art, and the scent of expensive cologne and freshly poured champagne filled the air. Every detail was designed to make the wealthy feel at home and make everyone else feel like they didn't belong. And for Rachel Coleman and her 2 children, it was obvious they didn't belong. Behind the front desk, Preston Whitmore adjusted his silk tie, his sharp blue suit flawless, his blonde hair slicked back like he had stepped straight out of a high-end men's magazine. He didn't just run the Sterling Grand. He was the Sterling Grand. To Preston, the hotel wasn't just a business. It was a symbol, a place where the elite gathered, where the rich indulged, where money wasn't just currency. It was a passcode. And Rachel Coleman had the wrong passcode. She stood in front of him, gripping her worn-out purse, her 2 kids clinging to her side. Her face was tight with exhaustion, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope, the kind that breaks when it meets reality. Preston had seen this type before. The strugglers, the desperate ones who thought money could buy them a place at his hotel, and he had zero interest in letting them in. "We don't have availability." Rachel cleared her throat. "I'd like to book a room. Just for the night." Preston barely glanced at her. "We don't have availability." Rachel shifted, pulling out a few crumpled bills from her purse. "Please, I can pay." Preston's lips curled into a polite but cold smile. "I don't think you understand, ma'am. We are at full capacity." Rachel's stomach twisted. She knew a lie when she heard one. A glance at the room listings on the digital board behind him showed plenty of suites still available. She licked her dry lips. "I have kids. They just need a warm bed for the night." Preston let out a small, condescending chuckle. "I'm afraid our establishment isn't equipped for emergency stays." Rachel's fingers curled into a fist around the cash. "I'm not asking for charity." Preston's smile disappeared entirely. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "We have a certain standard at the Sterling Grand. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Rachel's face burned. She felt every pair of eyes in the lobby on her, watching, judging, pretending not to care. The lobby was full of people, businessmen checking in, women in designer dresses sipping cocktails in the lounge, families in expensive coats laughing as they waited for their luggage. They all saw what was happening, and not one of them spoke up. A woman in a red dress glanced at Rachel, then quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in her phone. A businessman whispered something to his colleague, shaking his head. A couple sitting near the fireplace watched the scene unfold like it was entertainment, their faces unreadable. Rachel felt her breath hitch. It wasn't just Preston who was rejecting her. It was all of them. Elijah, her 10-year-old son, stared up at Preston, his small face filled with something that wasn't quite anger. It was disbelief, like he had just realized for the first time that some people would always see him as less. Rachel's heart shattered. She wanted to fight, to yell, to demand they be treated with dignity. But she was tired. And when you've been fighting for too long, there comes a moment when you realize, some battles, you just don't have the strength to win. She swallowed her pride, took Elijah's hand, and turned away. "Come on, baby," she murmured. Ava, her 7-year-old daughter, sniffled quietly as she followed. And just like that, they walked back into the cold. Noah Carter stood near the entrance, watching. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He was just a hotel employee trying to survive like everyone else. But right now, none of that mattered. Because what he had just seen, it didn't sit right with him. Noah had worked at the Sterling Grand for 2 years, and he had seen the way Preston operated. He knew the truth. It was never about availability. It was about who Preston believed deserved to be here. And that family? They never had a chance. Noah's hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around his phone. His heart hammered in his chest as he pulled it out and pressed record. The video wasn't long, just a few seconds, just enough to capture Preston's dismissive smirk. The judgment in his eyes. The way Rachel had tried one last time to be seen, only to be met with rejection. Noah had no grand plan. He wasn't thinking about what would happen next. He just knew one thing. People needed to see this. And once they did, Preston Whitmore wouldn't be able to hide behind his marble desk anymore. Noah Carter had never considered himself a rule breaker. He wasn't the kind of guy to stir up trouble or risk his job over something that wasn't his business. But as he stood near the entrance of the Sterling Grand, phone clenched in his hand, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Rachel Coleman and her 2 kids had just been humiliated in front of an entire room of wealthy strangers. And no one had done a thing. Not one person had spoken up. Not one person had told Preston Whitmore that this was wrong. And now, Rachel and her children were walking back into the cold, carrying the weight of a system designed to keep them outside. Noah's stomach twisted as he hit record. If no one else would say something, he would. The video wasn't long, just enough to show the truth. Rachel's face, tight with exhaustion, her hands shaking as she held out her money. Preston's smug smirk, his dismissive tone, his thinly veiled disgust as he refused to let them in. Elijah, 10 years old, looking up at Preston, not with anger, but with something far worse. The moment a child realizes the world is built against him. Noah's fingers trembled as he stopped the recording. His heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't stupid. If Preston found out he had filmed this, he'd be fired in a second. But deep down, Noah knew. This wasn't just another night at the hotel. This was something bigger. So, standing in the shadow of the grand entrance, he did something reckless, irreversible, and necessary. He hit upload. Within minutes, the video started gaining traction. Within an hour, it was spreading like wildfire. People in the comments were furious. How do you sleep at night turning away a mother and 2 kids? So the Sterling Grand only lets in the rich? Got it. Boycott. That little boy looked at him like he was seeing evil for the first time. That broke me. News outlets picked it up within hours, framing it as a brutal example of classism, racism, and modern-day gatekeeping. The hashtag started trending. Boycott Sterling, Grand. Let them in. This is America. By the time the morning sun hit Atlanta, millions of people had seen the footage. And one of those people? Shaquille O'Neal. In the penthouse of a high-rise overlooking Atlanta, Shaq sat in his oversized leather chair, scrolling through his phone. He had woken up early, his morning routine the same as always. Workout, breakfast, phone calls. But today, he had been sent the same video over 100 times. His name was all over Twitter, people tagging him, saying this was the kind of thing he needed to fix. He tapped the video, watched, and felt his jaw tighten. Because he had seen this before. It was a long time ago, but Shaq still remembered it like it was yesterday. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, standing at a counter, gripping his hand tight. She had asked for a table at a restaurant. The man behind the counter had given her the same kind of smile Preston had given Rachel, the kind that wasn't a smile at all. And just like that, they had been turned away, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they weren't the right kind of people. Shaq had been too young to understand what was happening. But later, when he was old enough to see the world for what it really was, that moment stayed with him. And now, watching Elijah's face on his phone screen, watching the way the boy had looked up at Preston, It all came back. Shaq could have ignored it, could have kept scrolling, kept his head down, stayed out of it. But that wasn't who he was. He had built his career fighting battles on the court. And now, he was ready to fight this one off it. So, Shaq grabbed his phone and made a call. A short one. No wasted words. Just 5 simple ones. Clear my morning. I'm going. Because if the Sterling Grand wanted to act like they owned the world, they were about to find out that some battles can't be bought. A midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up in front of the Sterling Grand Hotel. It wasn't just any car, it was a statement. The doors opened, and Shaquille O'Neal stepped out. All 7 feet 1 inch of him. The moment his feet hit the pavement, the energy outside the hotel shifted. Pedestrians slowed down, hotel staff froze mid-task, and the valet, who had been scrolling on his phone, nearly dropped a set of keys. People recognized him instantly. Not just because he was Shaq, but because everyone had seen the video. And now, he was here. Shaq adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy blue suit, his face unreadable as he took long strides toward the entrance. His usual laid-back charm? Gone. This wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about business. This was about principle. And when a man like Shaq moves with purpose, people notice. Inside the glass-walled lobby, hotel guests whispered, their eyes flicking between their phones and the massive figure heading straight for the front desk. Preston Whitmore had spent the morning damage controlling. Calls from corporate, an onslaught of bad press, angry emails from VIP clients threatening to cancel their stays. He wasn't in the mood for distractions. So when he looked up from his computer and saw Shaquille O'Neal walking toward him like a storm rolling in, his stomach dropped. But Preston Whitmore wasn't the type to fold. He had spent years in elite circles, where money could fix anything and reputation mattered more than morality. So he straightened his tie, smoothed back his hair, and forced a polite, thin-lipped smile as Shaq reached the desk. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, as if greeting a regular guest instead of a man who was about to dismantle his entire world. Shaq didn't shake his hand, didn't return the pleasantries. He just leaned forward, placing both massive hands on the polished marble counter, and said, "We need to talk." Preston barely flinched. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy at the moment." He glanced at his watch, a casual dismissal. "But if you'd like to make a reservation, I'd be happy to." Shaq's voice cut through the lobby. "You turned away a mother and her kids last night." Silence. A few guests stopped walking. A man sipping espresso at the lounge area froze mid-sip. Preston's smile tightened. "I assure you, Mr. O'Neal, we follow strict policies." Shaq's eyebrows raised slightly. "Policies that keep struggling families out?" Preston's fingers curled slightly against the desk, but he didn't break his calm. "I don't appreciate what you're insinuating." "I'm not insinuating," Shaq shot back. "I'm stating facts." A murmur rippled through the growing audience in the lobby. Preston exhaled through his nose, pressing his lips into a thin line. "I'm afraid you're misunderstanding the situation," he said, voice clipped. "This establishment has a standard to maintain. It is not a—" Shaq's head tilted. "A what?" Preston's mouth opened, but for the first time he hesitated. The weight of dozens of eyes on him, the cameras recording, the very real possibility that one wrong word could send the Sterling Grand into an even bigger PR disaster. He wasn't used to playing defense, and he was losing control of the game. By now, the entire lobby had stopped functioning. Employees had paused their tasks. Hotel guests pretended to be occupied with their drinks, but kept stealing glances. Even a few passers-by outside pressed against the glass windows, trying to see what was happening inside. People were watching, waiting, and Preston knew it. Preston forced another smile, but it was thin, fragile. This is all a misunderstanding. The hotel simply didn't have availability at the time. Shaq's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped, steady and firm. "You had open rooms." I checked. Preston's throat tightened. Shaq let the silence stretch, the weight of it crushing. Then he leaned in slightly, his next words deliberate. "You didn't turn them away because you had no space." He let that sit. You turned them away because you didn't want them here. A woman near the elevator gasped. Someone muttered, "Damn." Preston's cheeks flamed red. "I don't appreciate these accusations." "Then prove me wrong," Shaq challenged. "Compensate them. Publicly apologize. Fix what you did." Preston's jaw ticked. Shaq knew what was happening. Preston didn't want to lose. He had spent years in a world where men like him always won, where power and exclusivity were shields against accountability. But now, that shield was breaking. Shaq exhaled slowly, straightening up. "You know what?" he said, stepping back. "Forget an apology. That's not what I came for." Preston blinked, thrown off. "Excuse me?" Shaq turned slightly, scanning the lobby. Then he looked back at Preston. "I came to book a floor." Preston's confusion flickered into suspicion. "A floor?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah, the whole thing." A few people in the crowd gasped. Preston's composure cracked for the first time. What do you need a full floor for?" Shaq's smile was slow, deliberate. "To house families who need it." The lobby erupted in whispers. Preston looked like he had swallowed glass. His mind scrambled for an excuse, a way to say no without making things worse. But there wasn't one. Not now. Not with the world watching. Shaq glanced down at his watch. "I assume since this is a luxury hotel, you accept wire transfers?" Preston's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Of course." Shaq pulled out his phone. "Good," he said, tapping the screen. "Because I just sent it." Preston's phone buzzed a second later. His face drained of color. The payment had gone through. The entire floor belonged to Shaq now, and everyone in the room knew it. Shaq clapped Preston on the shoulder, his grip firm. "Appreciate your hospitality." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the entrance. The lobby remained silent as people processed what had just happened. And Preston? For the first time in his life, he had lost a battle money couldn't fix. But Shaq wasn't done yet, because buying a floor was just the start. The real fight was only the beginning. The moment Shaq booked an entire floor of the Sterling Grand, the air inside the hotel shifted. Preston Whitmore stood frozen behind the front desk, his polished composure cracking at the edges. He had spent years controlling the image of this hotel, a place where wealth was the only passport that mattered. And now, in the span of a few minutes, Shaquille O'Neal had flipped the script, turning the Sterling Grand into a symbol of hypocrisy and exclusion. And worst of all, people were watching. A murmur rippled through the lobby. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Guests whispered behind raised hands, and a few people near the entrance quietly lifted their phones to record. Preston straightened his tie, adjusting his stance, grasping for control. "Mr. O'Neal," he began, his voice carefully measured. "I think you may be misunderstanding our policies." Shaq raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh yeah? Which policy is that?" Preston clasped his hands together, exhaling as if dealing with an impatient child. "This hotel has a long-standing rule against housing." He hesitated. The word homeless was on the tip of his tongue, but he knew better than to say it. Instead, he carefully rephrased, "Individuals who do not meet our extended stay criteria." A few guests in the crowd frowned, sensing the dodge. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That's funny." Preston blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Shaq leaned against the marble counter, tapping a thick, ringed finger on the polished surface. "Last year, I was here for a charity event," he said, voice casual. "Saw a guy in the penthouse staying a full month. Never saw him work a day in his life." He let the silence hang. The tension thickened. Preston's lips pressed into a thin line. Shaq gave a slow nod. "So what you're saying is, this hotel has no problem housing the rich and unemployed. But a hard-working mother with kids? That's where you draw the line." A collective shift passed through the room. Even those who had been silent leaned in closer, watching Preston struggle for a response. His jaw tightened. "We simply uphold a certain standard." Shaq's eyes flickered with something colder. "A standard based on what?" Preston hesitated. And that's when it happened. Shaq folded his arms, waiting. "Go ahead. Say it." Preston licked his lips, uncomfortable. "I just mean, He trailed off, then tried again. The Sterling Grand serves a certain clientele. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The effect was instant. Several people in the crowd gasped softly. A woman near the concierge turned to her husband, eyes wide. Even the employees stiffened, knowing exactly what Preston had just implied. Shaq's face didn't change, but his presence did. He was already towering, already commanding the room without raising his voice. Now? He had all the power. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of those words sink in. Then he spoke. A certain clientele, huh? Preston swallowed. I didn't mean... Shaq nodded slowly. Nah, I got you. His voice was smooth, dangerous. So tell me something. He gestured around the gleaming gold-trimmed lobby, the plush leather seats, the grand piano playing softly in the background. These people? Shaq motioned toward the guests in their designer suits, their polished shoes, their pearl necklaces. They fit, right? Preston didn't answer. Shaq's gaze hardened. But a black woman with 2 kids? He let the words land. She doesn't. The room went dead silent. Preston opened his mouth, but there was no saving himself now. Because the cameras were rolling, and the world was about to hear every single word. Within minutes, the live-streamed confrontation spread like wildfire. First on Twitter, then TikTok, then major news outlets picked it up. Hotel manager exposed for racial discrimination, caught on camera. Shaq confronts corrupt hotel in powerful face-off. A certain clientele? What the Sterling Grand doesn't want you to know. The footage wasn't just damning. It was undeniable. Preston had spent his career hiding behind polished words and corporate policies. But now, he was exposed for exactly what he was. And there was no coming back from this. Back at the hotel, employees whispered in frantic clusters. Preston, his face pale, had retreated to his office, phone blowing up with calls from corporate. Shaq? He was done talking. He turned toward the lobby, scanning the people who had been silent just moments ago. Then he did something unexpected. He motioned toward a nearby staff member, a young concierge in his 20s, looking nervous but eager. Hey man, Shaq said. Can you check something for me? The concierge blinked, startled. Sure, Mr. O'Neal. Shaq tapped the counter. I need to know exactly how many open rooms you got tonight. The young man hesitated. Then, with the eyes of every guest and employee on him, he turned to his computer and typed. A beat of silence. Then the answer. 67 available rooms. The lobby exploded in whispers. Shaq nodded once, then turned toward the cameras. 67 rooms, he repeated, letting the number echo. Then he looked straight into the nearest lens. And they told that woman and her kids they didn't have one. The video cut there. And the internet detonated. By the time morning hit, the Sterling Grand was in full-blown crisis mode. Corporate released a statement, trying to distance themselves from Preston. But it was too late. Sponsors pulled partnerships. VIP clients canceled bookings. A class action lawsuit was already being drafted by civil rights attorneys. And Preston Whitmore? He had officially become the most hated hotel manager in America. Back in his penthouse, Shaq watched the news coverage unfold, his expression unreadable. He had won the battle. But the war wasn't over, because if this could happen here, it was happening everywhere. And Shaq wasn't the type to fix one problem and walk away. He set his phone down. Then, with calm precision, he picked it back up and made the call that would change everything. The internet didn't just react, it erupted. By the time the sun rose over Atlanta, the name Preston Whitmore was trending for all the wrong reasons. His face was everywhere. Screenshots from the video, memes tearing him apart, clips dissected on news panels. The world had seen exactly who he was, and there was no rewriting the narrative now. And the Sterling Grand? It was going down with him. Every major news outlet picked up the footage. CNN, NBC. Good Morning America. Even sports networks covered it, because this wasn't just about a hotel anymore. This was about power, racism, and the silent systems that protected men like Preston. Talk show debates got heated. Activists called it another example of discrimination hiding behind policy. Celebrities spoke out, disgusted by what they had seen. Shaq's former NBA teammates rallied behind him, tweeting support. "This ain't right. Mad respect to Shaq for stepping up." Dwayne Wade. "I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. Time's up on that nonsense." LeBron James. Even non-athletes got involved. Hollywood actors, musicians, politicians, they all took sides. And the Sterling Grand. It was losing. Badly. By noon, the hotel's phone lines were jammed. Not with reservations, with cancellations. High-profile guests pulled out of their bookings. Event planners dropped contracts. Sponsors for upcoming galas backed away, not wanting their brands associated with controversy. The hotel's board, a group of wealthy investors, went into full panic mode. Because money doesn't care about who's right or wrong. Money cares about one thing only: staying rich. A meeting was called. Urgent. Behind closed doors. The board members sat around a long oak table in a private conference room, staring at the crisis unfolding on their screens. "This is a disaster," one of them muttered, scrolling through an article titled, "How One Racist Manager Might Cost a Luxury Hotel Millions." Another board member rubbed his temples. "We need a statement. We need to fire Whitmore." Silence. Then the board's chairman sighed. "Get him in here." Minutes later, Preston walked in, unbothered. His suit was sharp. His smug confidence is still intact. He had built the Sterling Grand's reputation. He wasn't about to be pushed out. He took a seat, crossed his legs, and smirked. "So," he said, "who do I need to sue for defamation?" The board members exchanged glances. One cleared his throat. "Preston, we need to discuss your future here." Preston raised an eyebrow. "My future?" The chairman leaned forward. "We're losing millions. You need to step down." Preston laughed. A low, confident, unbothered chuckle. "You think firing me will fix this?" he asked, shaking his head. "That hotel is nothing without my name attached to it. I built this place." His voice was calm, controlled, dripping with arrogance. "This will blow over," he said. "Give it a week." The board members shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't going away," one of them muttered. Preston's smirk didn't falter. "Then we wait," he said. Because in his mind, money always won, and he still believed he couldn't lose. While the Sterling Grand scrambled to do damage control, Shaq had already made his next move. The hotel wasn't going to house Rachel's family? Fine. Shaq would do it himself. Not just for Rachel, for everyone who had ever been turned away, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong. That evening, Shaq walked back into the hotel lobby, calm but purposeful. Reporters had already swarmed the entrance, waiting for his response. But he didn't give them a speech. He gave them a statement that shook the Sterling Grand to its core. "I'm booking a floor," he said, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. A few gasps, a ripple of confusion, curiosity. Preston, watching from a distance, stiffened. Shaq turned to the receptionist, a different employee this time. Young, nervous, but eager to help. "Top floor," Shaq said. "Book the whole thing." The receptionist fumbled with the computer, looking over at a manager for approval. The manager hesitated, glancing at Preston. Preston's eyes burned with anger, but he gave a stiff nod. Because they couldn't refuse him. Not now. Not when the world was watching. Shaq's phone buzzed nonstop, texts, calls, notifications exploding. His booking wasn't just a hotel reservation. It was a statement, a power shift, a direct challenge, and the people loved it. Shaq just bought a whole floor for homeless families. This is how you use power. This man didn't just clap back. He took the whole damn building. Shaq just did more for struggling families in one night than this hotel has done in years. From his office window, Preston watched the cameras flash, the reporters scramble, the hotel staff whisper in hushed tones. He had spent years controlling the perception of the Sterling Grand. But now, Shaquille O'Neal had rewritten the story, and the world had picked a side, and it wasn't his. The Sterling Grand was no longer just a hotel. It was a crime scene, just one that hadn't been fully exposed yet. By now, The whole world knew what had happened in the lobby. The way Preston Whitmore had humiliated Rachel and her kids. The way Shaq had stepped in, flipping the power dynamic on its head. But what people didn't know? That was just the surface. And the deeper Shaq dug, the uglier the truth became. Noah Carter sat in the break room of the Sterling Grand, palms sweaty, heart pounding. He had risked everything by leaking the video of Rachel's rejection. But now, there was more. A lot more. And he couldn't stay quiet. He stared at his phone, then at the door, then back at his phone. Finally, with a deep breath, he sent the message. Noah, 2:13 p.m. Mr. O'Neal, you need to see what I've got. It's worse than you think. Shaq sat in his private office, phone buzzing with notifications. But this message? It stopped him cold. He read it twice, then once more. Worse than I think? He dialed immediately. Noah picked up on the second ring, his voice low and anxious. Mr. O'Neal, I work in the hotel's accounts department. I've been seeing things for a while, but after what happened to that woman, I started really looking. Shaq leaned forward, listening intently. There's a whole system at play, Noah continued, voice shaking. The hotel has been overcharging minority guests for years. Higher fees, hidden charges. Black families, Latino families. They're hit with unintentional price hikes all the time. If someone complains, it's brushed off as a clerical error. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. And the staff, Noah added, his voice barely above a whisper. Anyone who questions things, they get silenced, fired, replaced. Preston, he's just the face of it. The board knows. The investors know. They just pretend they don't. Shaq exhaled slowly. Send me everything you have. A pause. Then, I already did. Shaq glanced down at his laptop. A new email had just landed in his inbox. And when he opened it, his blood ran cold. The email was packed with spreadsheets, internal memos, and email exchanges. Clear proof of racial price inflation. Proof of funds being funneled into accounts that didn't exist on paper. And then, the worst part, a chain of emails between Preston and the corporate office. Preston, 6 months ago. Our usual clientele is complaining. Should we continue with the pricing strategy? Board executive, reply. Of course, those people will pay it, whether they like it or not. Shaq sat back in his chair, jaw locked, fingers tapping against his desk. This wasn't just discrimination. This was fraud. A lawsuit waiting to happen. A scandal big enough to bury the entire hotel chain. And Preston? He had just become the weakest link. The next morning, Shaq walked into the Sterling Grand again. This time, he wasn't here to make statements. He was here to watch an empire crumble. Preston must have felt it coming, because when Shaq walked into the office lounge, the manager was already waiting, calm on the outside. But his eyes were flickering with panic. He didn't waste time. Mr. O'Neal, Preston started, forcing a smirk. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Shaq said nothing, just stared. Preston exhaled, shifting slightly. Look, we both know how the media works. This outrage, it'll die down. But damage has been done. To both of us. Shaq's brow arched slightly, as if amused. Preston leaned in, lowering his voice. What if we helped each other out? Shaq didn't react, so Preston pushed forward. I can make all this go away, he said smoothly. We can donate to a charity of your choice. Publicly, of course. A nice photo op. We issue an apology. You make a statement about how we're taking steps to improve. He paused, eyes sharp. And in return, you drop whatever you're planning. Shaq finally leaned in, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes locked onto Preston's. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Let me get this straight, he said, voice calm. You want me to let this hotel keep scamming people? Preston chuckled dryly. Scamming? That's a strong word. It's just a business. Shaq's smirk vanished. For the first time, Preston looked nervous. Shaq sat back, rubbing his chin. And what do I get? Preston grinned, relieved that Shaq was playing ball. You keep your name clean. You get to be the hero, but without any lawsuits. Everyone wins. He leaned back, crossing his legs. It's the smart move. A beat of silence. Then Shaq chuckled. A deep, knowing laugh that made Preston's smirk flicker. That's cute, Shaq muttered. But I don't make deals with men like you. Preston's smile dropped. Shaq stood up. You don't get to throw a little charity money around and pretend you fix this. You don't get to keep hiding behind rules you created to keep people like Rachel out. Preston's jaw clenched. I was offering you a way out. Shaq's eyes darkened. You think I need a way out? He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, then turned it toward Preston. A headline was already up. Breaking. Shaquille O'Neal to file lawsuit against the Sterling Grand for discriminatory business practices. Preston's face was drained of color. You were never offering me a way out, Shaq said coolly. I was already walking through the front door. By the time Shaq left the hotel, the internet had already exploded. Again. Legal experts weighed in. Civil rights organizations announced their support for the lawsuit. The hotel's board members panicked, realizing this wasn't just about PR anymore. This was about survival. Preston tried to hold on, tried to convince the board to fight back. But the moment financial fraud entered the conversation, they cut him loose. A board meeting was held behind closed doors. And when it ended, Preston Whitmore was fired. When reporters flooded Shaq's next public event, asking for a statement, he simply shrugged. Justice doesn't come from a photo op and a press release, he said. It comes from changing the way we do business. And then, before stepping off the stage, he added, people like Preston built their careers keeping doors closed. He smiled. I'm just here to kick them open. The Sterling Grand Hotel had always been a place of power, wealth, and exclusivity. But now, it was a battleground. For days, the media storm refused to die down. Every news outlet, every talk show, every headline was about one thing: Preston Whitmore and the corruption buried inside the Sterling Grand. And now, after weeks of mounting pressure, lawsuits, and public outrage, the hotel's corporate owners had no choice but to act. It was time for damage control, and they knew exactly who had to go first. A press conference was scheduled, a grand setup, cameras flashing, microphones lined up, a corporate executive standing behind the podium with a tight, forced smile. Millions of people tuned in live. Then, the words that sealed it. Effective immediately, the Sterling Grand has terminated Preston Whitmore's employment. The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions, Twitter exploded, and every major network broadcasted the moment in real time. Preston Whitmore, the man who built his career keeping doors closed, had just been thrown out of one. And Shaq? He was watching. While the world celebrated Preston's downfall, Shaq was already 2 steps ahead. Because firing one man didn't fix the problem. The system was still broken. The policies, the elitism, the quiet ways people like Preston had been allowed to thrive for years. That's what needed to change. And Shaq knew exactly how to do it. The morning after Preston's firing, Shaq made a phone call, not to a reporter, not to a lawyer, but to a team of investors. I want to buy the Sterling Grand. The room went silent. Then, after a beat, are you serious? Shaq smirked. Dead serious. By the time the deal was finalized, the world had already picked sides. The public had rallied behind Shaq, not just because of who he was, but because of what he stood for. And when the official announcement came, it was bigger than anyone imagined. Not only had Shaq bought the hotel, he was transforming it. The Sterling Grand would still be a luxury stay, but with a difference. 1 floor, permanently reserved for struggling families in need of emergency housing. A new mentorship program, giving kids and young adults opportunities they never had before. And a clear, unshakable message. This was no longer a place that kept people out. It was a place that brought them in. The reaction was overwhelming. People cheered. Donations poured in. Celebrities, athletes, business leaders. They all wanted to be part of what Shaq had built. And the best part? Rachel and her kids returned, not as outcasts, but as guests. The doors that had once been slammed in their faces, now, they stood wide open. At the reopening ceremony, Shaq stood before a packed crowd, a man who had won not just a battle, but a legacy. He kept his speech short, simple, powerful. This place used to be a symbol of exclusion. Now, it's a symbol of change. He looked out at the crowd, at the families, at the kids running through the new space, and he smiled. Because real power, real success, it's not about keeping people out, it's about bringing them in. A year had passed, but the Sterling Grand was unrecognizable. The grand marble floors still gleamed. The crystal chandeliers still shimmered. The 5-star service was still impeccable. But the energy? Completely different. Once, this hotel had been a fortress of exclusivity, a place where people like Rachel Coleman and her kids were turned away without a second thought. Now, it was a place of second chances. And today, for the first time in a year, Rachel was coming back. The moment Rachel stepped through the entrance, she felt it. Gone were the cold stares and hushed whispers. Gone was the stifling sense of being unwelcome. Instead, the lobby was buzzing with life. A group of hotel employees stood near the check-in desk, chatting with guests. A young couple laughed as they admired the new art wall showcasing local talent. A family sat near the fireplace, kids curled up on the couch, sharing a plate of fresh-baked cookies from the lounge. Warmth, energy, belonging. Rachel's heart swelled. A year ago, she had walked out of this very lobby in shame, clutching her children's hands, humiliated and hopeless. Now, she was walking back in as a guest. She glanced down at her son, Elijah, now 11, standing beside her. He wasn't clinging to her this time. He wasn't looking down. He was standing tall, eyes scanning the space, taking it all in. And then, the words that hit Rachel's chest like a wave. "It feels different, Mom." She smiled, blinking back unexpected tears. "Yeah, baby," she whispered. "It really does." The transformation of the Sterling Grand wasn't just about a new coat of paint and better PR. It was about a new mission. One that Shaquille O'Neal had made sure was more than just words. A full floor was permanently reserved for families in need of emergency housing. A mentorship program had been launched, connecting kids with professionals in business, sports, and the arts. A new scholarship initiative had been created, ensuring that kids who once saw only closed doors now had pathways to opportunity. It was still a luxury hotel, but it was also so much more, and the people loved it. Celebrities, business leaders, athletes, everyday folks. The public had rallied behind Shaq, proving that kindness and integrity were worth more than exclusivity and status. And the Sterling Grand? It had become a symbol of change. On the top floor of the hotel, Shaq stood by the window, hands in his pockets, gazing out over the Atlanta skyline. A year ago, he had walked into this place ready for war. He had called out the corruption, flipped the system, and watched an empire crumble in real time. But looking at the hotel now, he didn't see a victory. He saw what came after. Because winning wasn't just about exposing what was wrong. It was about building something better. And this was better. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the rooftop court, the newest addition to the Sterling Grand. Shaq leaned against the railing, watching as kids laughed, played, and dribbled basketballs across the polished hardwood. And then, in the middle of it all, Elijah. The same boy who had once stood in that cold lobby, defeated, rejected, questioning his worth. Now, he was dribbling down the court. Confidence in every step, his movements smooth, controlled, powerful. Shaq smiled. Not because of the hotel, not because of the business success, but because of that moment. A moment that proved the fight had been worth it. Some battles expose the problem, others build the solution. Shaq didn't just fight, he changed the game. The question isn't who will stand up next. The question is, will it be you?